74, give me 5, 74, 1, 5, 1, 6, 74, 1, 75, give me 6, 76, 7 guineas, give me 78. 79, 71, 72, 73, 74, give me 5, 74, 1, 5, 1, 6, 74, 1, 75, give me 6, 76, 7 guineas.
We've all got different views of how much people should earn, and our three panellists here are going to distribute £100 between 4 occupations according to their values. Now, Joyce Winstead, you're a hospital worker from Barnsley. How much of your £100 would you give to this chap? He's a managing director of a firm employing, say, 500 people, heavily employed in exporting. So, how much?
20, because he could have a responsible job, not always.
Dave Newton, you're a shop steward with a chemical company. How much are you going to give the company boss?
35, because I believe this is a pretty responsible job, yes.
And Ken Ashcroft, you're a manager yourself. How much are you going to give a fellow manager?
I would award 40 because there's the need to encourage risk-taking and also because of the high incidence of personal taxation.
Right, on with the parade. Here's another job, a nurse. A staff nurse, responsible job once again. Joyce, how much are you going to give to this person?
I would give the nurse 25, for the reasons being that when the managing director has his coronaries and the miner has his accidents, the nurse has got to be there to put him back onto the road to recovery so that he can input into the economy of the country once again.
OK, fine. Dave?
20 for the nurse, working long hours. It's a dedicated job.
And Ken?
20 also, because they are basically a service industry and therefore are consuming from the wealth-generating sector.
Right, a third occupation now. Here's a coal miner. A face worker, even in this day and age, a dangerous and dirty job. How much for the coal miner, Joyce?
25 for the coal miner because of the dangerous and health hazards.
Dave?
I give the coal miner 30. It's a pretty hazardous job working underground. Yes, 30.
And Ken?
25 because it is actually a wealth-generating sector with a productivity element.
Fine. And finally, a school teacher. Is the school teacher working in a secondary school? How much would you give, Joyce, to the school teacher?
30.
Dave?
15.
And Ken?
15.
Well, let's just see how the panel's scoring compared with reality. Now, these are the scores that you gave, and this is the way £100 is distributed according to their actual relative earnings. So there are quite sharp differences between the panellists about how they value the 4 occupations and their actual market value. And we've not finished with you yet, I'm afraid, because these disagreements about what constitutes a fair distribution of income are indirectly one of the main obstacles to getting the economy going again on an expansionary path. As you'll see in a moment, when we ask you to put yourself in the role of a cabinet committee pursuing just such a policy. The techniques for reflating the economy to get production rising and unemployment falling are familiar enough. They're those outlined by Keynes many years ago and still valid today. Lower taxes, higher public spending, reduced interest rates, all raising the level of demand in the economy so that firms find their order books filling and workers are drawn back into employment. But as we've learned in the past, this reflationary road is fraught with hazards. When the economy is expanded by pumping in more demand, 2 major and interrelated problems arise. The first is that the balance of payments begins to deteriorate as imports rise faster than exports. Brian Henry of the National Institute.
Certainly the reflationary package could be expected to worsen the balance of payments. My argument is it would probably worsen it from a really quite healthy position. Of course, it could actually put the balance of payments into severe deficit if you had a policy that was sufficiently expansionary.
So what does the National Institute propose?
In part, one would allow for a devaluation. In part, there would be exchange rate changes which would be necessitated as a result of this expansion.
Of what order?
I think we're talking about 15% change in the exchange rate.
Devaluation, by making exports cheaper and imports dearer, may at least for a while deal with the balance of payments problem, but at a cost, as Terry Ward of the Cambridge Economic Policy Group stresses.
The problem with devaluation is that it's very inflationary. If one starts with the present situation where British goods are perhaps 20 or 30% less cost competitive as compared with other goods produced in other countries, then one needs a 20 or 30% devaluation merely to get back to where we were, say, 2 or 3 years ago. Now, if one wants to go further than that and devalue in order to provide additional jobs, additional employment, then what we're talking about is a 40, 50, perhaps 60% devaluation. And the problem with that is that immediately, 60% devaluation, would add immediately 20% to domestic cost, domestic prices, so that the level of inflation in this country would accelerate by 20%, literally, perhaps overnight.
Even those who favour reflation plus devaluation agree that they'd come across a further hazard. It would be potentially inflationary because of higher import prices. Not because increased spending is financed by higher government spending, because they reject the monetarist theory that inflation is caused by too much money. Instead, expansionists are worried about the twist that higher import prices give to the wage price spiral. So, how would they cope with it?
Well, essentially, of course, one has to break the link between price wage increases in the inflationary spiral, so that what we're seeing is a policy where the lower exchange rate increases import prices, which increases the general price level, which then feeds on to wage settlements, and these in turn feed on to prices. What I would propose is that the way to break this cycle is to cut in with an incomes policy of some sort.
A prices and incomes policy? Well, that's certainly been tried before without too much success. So what are the main difficulties in agreeing on a workable prices and incomes policy? Our panel is now going to assume the role of a cabinet committee faced with just that problem. And in drawing up that policy, they can call on the services of their economic advisor, Professor Peston, who sets the scene for them.
We're in a position where we want to expand, where we still have some inflation that we don't like, but we fear that if we do expand more rapidly again, that inflation will get worse still. So that's the situation in which we find ourselves. And we start to talk about incomes policy really as a way of saying, does it help us to expand the economy, to get rid of unemployment, or some of the unemployment we've got, while not intensifying the inflation problem? I mean, would you all be happy if in 2 years' time the inflation rate was still 7.5% per annum?
I think 7.5% is not a bad figure. I think in looking at our own inflation rate, it has to be looked at in context with the general world inflation rate, and if ours is at 7.5%, and yet the other major countries with whom we compete is higher than 7.5%, then I think we're to be congratulated.
Yeah, so you think that we could afford to take still a little bit of an inflation risk? I mean, would that be the consensus view? That was your view, Mrs. Windsor.
Yes, I think we could keep inflation, but not as high as it is, if we could lower it a little bit.
What do we think we can afford? What are the parameters we're working in? What does the Treasury advise us on that?
Maybe in terms of real money, we're talking about 1.5, maybe 2 pence in the pound. 1.5 to 2% is what we can really afford. Our problem is, how do you go from inflation rates of 7.5% per annum, money wages rising at, say, getting on for 10% per annum in the economy at large, earnings rising at that rate, to any possible lower level? And is it realistic, Mr. Newton, for us to be thinking in terms of numbers as low as that? What do you, I mean?
No, I think that to consider increases in the range that you've suggested of 1.5–2% would be totally unrealistic. Whilst it may do wonders for the inflation rate, I can see that consumer spending would bottom out and fall completely. With only a small increase, then people won't have the money to spend in shops. Yes. I can see production falling even further, which creates problems with unemployment.
But Professor, I think we need a little advice here. I mean, hopefully we're not going to construct a short-term policy. This seems to me to be the disaster of all attempts to regulate incomes, that they've been short-term and taken very much on the spur of the moment. Therefore, we need some advice on a longer-term scenario.
Obviously, the question of a permanent or a longer-run versus shorter-run incomes policy is, again, a political decision for you to decide. It's not for advisors to tell you what has to be done. If you want something that lasts longer, then you've got to say, well, that's your policy.
I'm putting to you, gentlemen, that for a start, we will give a flat rate increase this year to all employees because we cannot any longer continue to give percentage increase rises, which widens the differentials of the employees, which is always to the disadvantage of the low-paid worker.
No, I think that that's an unacceptable type of incomes policy. It has been tried numerous times in the past, and it's created difficulties. And the biggest problem that it causes is that by rewarding everyone equally with a flat sum, a certain amount of money, whatever that money is, then if there is to be any long-term incomes policy, this will eventually destroy what differentials there are.
And I'd like to add to that it doesn't also take account of the progressive nature of the personal taxation system. We need to have a motivating system of incomes, and if we put a flat rate on, then it means obviously more to the non-taxpayer, of which there are very few, to the high-income earner, of which again there are very few, but we need a graded system between. I mean, frankly, we've had lots of history of the flat rate, and none of them have been particularly successful.
No, I don't agree, for the simple reason we're talking about the widening of the differentials, and I've just heard from a colleague of my cabinet that the differential would be narrowed. I think that's a nonsense. If you take, for a start, that you have a £10 and a £20 start, and then you have, if we decide to give £6 across the board this year, you'll still have that £10 difference in the pay.
There's some organisations, some companies better capable of paying a flat rate than others, and essentially this becomes an imposition. Also, some organisations are in a growth situation and could perhaps pay a little more. Perhaps they're going to get a little more productivity. Therefore, these things need to be taken into account.
With inflation, if groups of workers in different grades get the same flat rate increase, then that will destroy the differentials that are here now. Now, you may not agree with the particular differentials, but they are there now, and until you can set a base rate up to decide what the differential should be, I think you've got to move away from the flat rate increase that you're proposing.
We would like to feel that we were an innovative government, and I think we would like to consider alternatives. Both of these have been tried in the past. The percentage linked to productivity was tried, and there is a difficulty of measurement. I think we ought to look for something a little more scientific in the 80s.
But I think Ken's been a little unfair there, because whilst he has expressed objections to both the suggestions that Joyce and I have put forward, you've outlined the problems there. Ken, you haven't given the solutions. You haven't given the solution that you would advocate.
The problem very much determines itself to who is regulatable and who is not. And I mean, if I were to report my friends from the CBI, I'm sure they'd tell me that on the whole, their employees are reasonably regulable by market forces. But how do we then deal with the electricity workers, the gas workers, who are essentially monopolistic?
Yes. But even by market forces, hasn't our experience for the last couple of years been such that those market forces require much more unemployment than essentially we've regarded as acceptable? But is anybody, I mean, are you suggesting, I remember one of the past incomes policies that previous governments have introduced involved a productivity element, that it said that those whose efficiency rose more rapidly should get larger pay increases. Now, is that going to be part of our policy?
No, I don't advocate that at all. If it always means that the people who have the advantage of being able to work to produce they are always coming out on top. Some people are not in that position, and especially in the public sector. And I think we've got to look at that and analyse it. Some people are not, as I've said, not in a position where they can gear their income to the productivity.
Are we going to be happy with an incomes policy as it stands, or do we have views about the prices side? I mean,
I think that's terribly important. I don't think you can have one without the other. It is a price and incomes policy. I can't imagine there can be any benefit from regulating prices if we're to let regulating incomes if we're to let prices just feel the market force. I think that however difficult it may be, we must have a hand in regulating the basic prices that affect everybody in day-to-day life.
I believe if we can find a way of regulating incomes, prices will take care of themselves. I think at the end of the day, if we start getting into a full regulation policy, we're into an enormous overhead on the national exchequer apart from anything else.
How on earth are you going to get a policy like that across to the public? It's going to be totally unpalatable because the public have long memories of incomes policies. And in fact, that's the first thing the public are going to ask of any government, particularly ours. How are we going to get the message across by just clamping down on one side of the scale, on one side of the equation? You must look at both sides.
And there's a lot more tough discussion like this before Dave Newton presents their agreed proposals.
We have put together an incomes policy, which would consist of basically a flat rate of £5 to everyone, with an additional 3% of their earnings on top. But we have decided to keep about 1 or 2% of the total pay bill that we have in reserve to use for special skills, scarcities, special cases, responsibility jobs. So we're keeping that in reserve so that we can judge some cases on merit. An important part of the package is that it is permanent, insofar as we see that this will be with us as far as we can see anyway. But we also believe, and this is important, that we have to persuade the public, rather than legislate, we have to persuade the public to accept this. And what we have decided to do is introduce a prices element where we will monitor very closely prices in the public sector and in the private sector that has a monopoly. I think of banks here. We will monitor those very carefully to ensure that if there are any price increases, then they're kept within certain limits.
Well, that's a formidable and comprehensive package. Professor Peston, clearly a consensus is necessary if you're going to carry a policy like this. Here's a cabinet compromise. Do you think it would succeed?
I think it would have a chance of succeeding. I mean, consensus is clearly the only way we can proceed at all in our society, and the cabinet itself, we saw its discussion, was having to get together to give up some of its, each person giving up some of his most favoured views in order to get to an agreement. So I think that everybody can learn that we have to modify our views in order to get a basis for policy where we can all then advance and all be better off.
But do you think they would carry the country with that sort of package?
I think there are certain grounds for optimism. The most obvious is the negative one. After the appalling economic experience of the last 2 or 3 years, the stagnation, the rise in unemployment, people must be saying that there's got to be a better way of running our affairs. And I think that's one reason. Secondly, most incomes policies in the past have been introduced in a state of crisis and contraction. As you yourself have pointed out, the incomes policy we're talking about here would be introduced at least in stable, if stagnant circumstances, but on the basis that we would be expanding. In other words, we would be bringing people into jobs as part of the incomes policy, we would be producing more output, and I think on the whole, putting the two sides together, the positive expansion, the appreciation of the appalling consequences from lack of agreement, gives us some grounds for optimism, but I would only say some grounds. I am not the sort of person who believes that from now on policy making is easy, even on the basis of the package once put forward.
Well, thank you, Professor Peston, and thank you, panel, for your common sense in grappling with this difficult matter. Very real problems which would have to be faced if ever prices and incomes policies attempted again. So what does seem clear is that it would only succeed on the basis of consensus, and that consensus is more likely to be achieved when expansion is allowing real incomes to be increased rather than held back.